You may think that Vikings were just bloodthirsty warriors, charging through villages, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. But here's something that might surprise you. Vikings were also masters of psychological warfare. They were not just fierce fighters, they knew how to manipulate the minds of their enemies before they even stepped foot on their shores. They didn't need to be everywhere at once because their very name was enough to send shivers down the spines of kingdoms. Imagine this, you're a ruler in 9th century Europe and word comes in that a Viking fleet is approaching. You've heard the stories of how they slaughter entire towns, steal everything in sight, and burn villages to the ground. Just hearing that name sends a wave of panic through your soldiers. Your first instinct is to prepare for the worst, but is there even a chance to fight back? This wasn't a coincidence. It was all part of the Viking strategy, one they mastered better than anyone else. The Vikings didn't just fight with swords and axes, they fought with fear. Before they even set foot on enemy soil, Vikings used their terrifying reputation to paralyze their enemies into submission, which cut through the sea like silent predators, were part of the psychological tactic. Imagine seeing one of those longships cutting through the mist at dawn, their sails black, their warriors standing at the ready. It wasn't just an invasion, it was a show of force meant to frighten. The psychological effects of Viking raids were far-reaching, often influencing battles before they even began. But their psychological tactics didn't stop with their ships. Vikings also had an uncanny ability to spread rumors and create myths about their brutal raids. Their reputation for cruelty wasn't just something they embraced, it was something they crafted. Every raid became an opportunity to solidify their image. The more terror they caused, the stronger their reputation grew. And it was this reputation that often worked in their favor. Enemies, already on edge, would often make strategic errors out of fear. The Vikings knew that fear can be more damaging than a blade. It leaves armies scattered, makes leaders hesitate, and turns an enemy's best laid plans into dust. It's easy to think the Vikings simply overwhelmed their foes with numbers and raw strength. But in reality, it was the fear of the unknown, the terror of Viking brutality, that made them so dangerous. Take the Viking raid on Lindisfarne, one of the most infamous in history. When Vikings arrived at this isolated monastery in 793, the shock was profound. The monks, who were mostly unarmed and not prepared for war, had no idea how to fight back. But it wasn't just the Vikings' brutality that made this raid stand out. It was the sheer psychological shock. The monks had never seen anything like it before. The Vikings' ability to appear without warning, strike fast and vanish into the mist, turned their raid into a symbol of terror for all of Europe. This is where their true power lay, not in their swords or their shields, but in their ability to make everyone else feel helpless. If you could get into your enemy's head before the fight even started, you were halfway to winning. And that's exactly what the Vikings did. They weren't just invaders, they were fear itself personified. What's even more shocking is that the Vikings didn't need to rely on sheer force to win every battle. They knew how to manipulate their opponents psychologically. Their reputation alone was often enough to cause chaos. By the time their opponents mustered the courage to mount a defense, the Vikings were already long gone, having done their damage. It was a strategy that didn't require mass destruction in every raid, but used the fear of destruction to keep enemies on the back foot. Picture this, a group of Vikings descending on a peaceful village, their ships pulling up to the shore as they let out a primal roar. It was said that their battle cries could be heard miles away, echoing across the land like a signal of doom. It said that these cries were so chilling that they caused some enemies to break and flee before even seeing the Viking warriors. And then there's the psychological warfare during battle. The Vikings were known for their bloodthirsty demeanor on the battlefield, but they also used intimidation tactics in combat. They didn't just fight to win, they fought to make their opponents break mentally. Their battle formations, combined with their terrifying appearance and relentless aggression, shattered enemy lines both physically and mentally. But let's think for a moment. Why did this work so well? Why did fear have such a stronghold on Viking enemies? Well, it's simple. Fear paralyzes. The Vikings understood that people often make their worst decisions when they are afraid. Terrified enemy won't think strategically. They'll make rash decisions, they'll panic, and they'll scatter. It's not just about the Viking strength, it's about how they made their enemies feel. They didn't fight to just conquer, they fought to dominate every aspect of the mind. When their enemies heard that a Viking raid was coming, they didn't just fear the soldiers, they feared the consequences of the raid. They feared the pain, the loss, the humiliation. And when you fear something so deeply it controls you, this psychological aspect was one of the most powerful weapons the Vikings wielded. They didn't just invade, they invaded your peace of mind. And that's what made them such powerful enemies. And yet, for all their terrifying raids and psychological tactics, it was the fear itself that was the true weapon. The Vikings weren't simply savages, they were masterminds of fear. Every battle they fought, every raid they carried out, reinforced their image as ruthless conquerors. And that reputation, carefully cultivated over years of brutal raids, continued to grow stronger with every fear-driven whisper that spread across Europe. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The Vikings knew that fear alone wouldn't win every battle. As we'll see in the next section, their power wasn't just in terror, it was in how they used fear to manipulate the very systems that held their enemies together. You might think of the Vikings as nothing more than wild barbarians, their raids fueled solely by bloodlust and chaos. But the truth, their success in battle came from something far more calculated than brute force. What made the Vikings such powerful enemies wasn't just their physical physical strength. It was their strategic brilliance. Let me explain. You see, Vikings were highly organized, and their raids were more precise than you could ever imagine. While many people think of Viking invasions as random and reckless, the reality is that these attacks were planned down to the smallest detail. The Vikings were experts in the art of war, using surprise and precision as their secret weapons. Consider this: a Viking raid wasn't just a group of bloodthirsty warriors storming into a village. It was an orchestrated event. Vikings had a unique way of organizing their raids. They knew exactly when and where to strike, and they did so with ruthless efficiency. Their success was rooted in this organization. One of the most fascinating aspects of Viking warfare was their use of longships. These ships weren't just impressive feats of engineering. They were a key component in the Vikings' highly organized raiding strategy. Thanks to their design, these longships allowed Vikings to attack with incredible speed, often catching their enemies off guard. The Vikings could sail in and out of ports quickly, disappearing as swiftly as they had arrived, leaving behind chaos in their wake. Their ability to disappear and strike again made them unpredictable, and unpredictability is a powerful weapon in warfare. Imagine being a local ruler, suddenly hearing that Vikings were approaching your shores. You'd have no idea where they would land next. You'd have no idea if they were coming today, tomorrow, or the next week. Their sudden strikes created chaos among their enemies, who could never quite predict when or where the next raid would happen. But it wasn't just about speed. It was about the precision with which the Vikings executed their attacks. They weren't mindlessly looting and pillaging. Vikings used their intelligence to pick strategic targets: towns, villages, or monasteries with rich resources or weak defenses. They knew the best times to strike, often when their targets were least prepared. Vikings would strike when their enemies had let their guard down, during festivals or times of peace, capitalizing on any vulnerability. And there's more. The Vikings were also skilled in gathering intelligence. They didn't just sail into a town without knowing what they were up against. They had spies, merchants, and even fellow raiders who would provide them with vital information about enemy defenses. This information allowed the Vikings to plan their raids with extreme precision, giving them the upper hand even before they landed on enemy shores. Think about it. How many warriors do you know who were just as skilled in gathering intelligence as they were in wielding a sword? The Vikings were not just about brute force. They were calculated, smart, and highly organized. They knew exactly when and where to strike, making them a terrifying enemy to face. The combination of speed, surprise, and intelligence is what made the Vikings so formidable. They weren't just brute strength. They were a well-oiled machine of war. This is what set them apart from other warrior cultures of the time. While others may have relied on strength alone, the Vikings combined that strength with strategy, using their intelligence and preparation to outmaneuver their opponent. But what made them even more dangerous was the way they would disappear as quickly as they came. In many cases, after carrying out their raids, the Vikings would retreat into the vast seas. They didn't just leave behind a pile of treasure. They left their enemies shaken, unsure of when they might return. The psychological impact of such raids couldn't be understated. It created a sense of fear and uncertainty that kept enemies on edge, always wondering when the next raid would occur. And this uncertainty was precisely what the Vikings wanted. They thrived on creating an atmosphere of fear, and it wasn't just because of their physical presence. The mere thought of Viking raids was enough to cause panic, and it was this fear that often made them so successful. As much as their strength and speed made them dangerous, it was their ability to make their enemies fear the unknown that made them powerful. But here's where it gets even more interesting. This level of organization wasn't just reserved for their raids. Vikings applied the same strategic thinking to their settlements and their social structures. Unlike many other cultures at the time, the Vikings were not a disorganized mob of warriors. They had laws, customs, and social structures that helped keep them united and focused. Take their system of government, for example. The Vikings didn't rely on a single ruler or king to make decisions. Instead, they had a council of leaders who made decisions together. This democratic system, known as the Thing, helped maintain order within Viking society and gave them the strength to organize raids efficiently. So, what made the Vikings such powerful enemies? Was it their physical strength alone? No, it was their ability to plan, strategize, and outthink their opponents. It was their combination of strength, intelligence, and speed that made them a force to be reckoned with. And yet, for all their efficiency, there's still one question that lingers. Why was the Viking reputation for brutality so important? How did this reputation play a role in their success as warriors? Well, that's where things start to get even more complex. In the next section, we'll dive into how the Vikings used their reputation for savagery and fear as another strategic tool. Because in the world of Viking warfare, terror wasn't just a byproduct of their raids. It was a weapon they wielded with as much skill as their axes. Vikings didn't just create fear through their brutal raids. They knew exactly how to keep their enemies divided and powerless. It's easy to think of Viking society as just a collection of warriors bent on conquest, but what if I told you that their legal system, a set of rules that most people overlook, played a huge role in their success? Yes, it turns out Viking law wasn't just about maintaining order within their own ranks. It was a strategic weapon that fractured their enemies and kept them from uniting against the Viking threat. Now imagine you are an enemy kingdom trying to build a defense against Viking raids. You've managed to gather a coalition of local tribes and neighboring kingdoms to fight back, but suddenly you start to notice cracks within your alliances. The Vikings didn't need to break your army. They broke your unity. How? By simply simply operating under a system of laws that made it difficult for other groups to cooperate effectively. The Vikings had a strong yet flexible system of laws that governed not just their communities, but the way they interacted with outsiders. Their legal system was based on honor, justice, and community cohesion. In Viking society, maintaining your word was sacred, and breaking an oath was considered a grave offense. For Viking leaders, this was key to keeping their warriors and communities loyal. The Viking code was clear. Honor and loyalty were paramount, and anyone who broke these rules was punished severely. But here's the twist. When Viking laws came into contact with other societies, they didn't just inspire respect, they often led to division. You see, Viking law was more than just a set of rules. It was a statement of Viking superiority. It created a moral framework that stood in stark contrast to the legal systems of their enemies, often leading to resentment and discord among the groups they encountered. In some cases, the Viking presence in a region didn't just represent a physical threat, it represented a challenge to the very order and authority that local societies had built over generations. The Vikings knew exactly how to exploit these differences. When they raided foreign lands, they didn't just steal treasures or pillage towns. They sowed seeds of discord among the local population. Take, for example, the Vikings' impact on England during the early years of the Danelaw. By establishing their own legal system and enforcing it with brutal efficiency, they didn't just carve out a piece of land, they created a rift between the Anglo-Saxons and the Norse settlers. Viking laws and customs often made their enemies question their own systems of governance, which in turn made it harder for kingdoms to unite against the Viking threat. But it wasn't just the Vikings' law that made them such feared neighbors. It was how they used their legal system as a tool for maintaining control. Unlike other medieval societies, where power was concentrated in the hands of a single ruler or a small group of elites, Viking law was often communal, with decisions made by local chieftains and leaders in open forums. This not only gave the Vikings a sense of unity, but also helped them adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Contrast this with their enemies, many of whom were bound by rigid feudal systems or monarchies. Viking communities were often more flexible, able to make quick decisions in times of crisis. This flexibility gave them an edge, especially when they faced larger, more bureaucratic societies. While other kingdoms were bogged down by lengthy deliberations or power struggles between lords, the Vikings could act swiftly and decisively, using their legal system to unite their people and destabilize their enemies. But what's even more fascinating is how the Vikings used their legal system as a psychological weapon. Imagine being a local lord or king, surrounded by Viking warriors who follow their own laws that you don't fully understand. The Vikings made it clear that anyone who went against their legal code would face severe consequences. This created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty among their enemies. If you couldn't understand the laws by which your enemy operated, it became much harder to fight back effectively. In some cases, Viking law was so different from what their enemies knew that it became a point of confusion and fear. In the Viking world, the idea of community justice was taken very seriously. Any action that disrupted the harmony of the community, such as betrayal or dishonesty, was punished harshly. This focus on communal integrity worked in the Vikings' favor when they were raiding and conquering. They presented themselves not only as warriors, but as enforcers of a strict, honorable code of conduct, something that made them both admired and feared. But here's a surprising fact. The Vikings didn't just use their laws to control their own people. They used them to manipulate the very people they conquered. When they invaded new lands, they didn't just impose their laws. They offered an alternative to the existing order. In some cases, the Vikings were able to integrate local leaders into their system by offering them a chance to maintain some authority under Viking law. Thus, this gave their enemies a difficult choice: resist and risk the full wrath of the Viking legal system, or comply and risk being seen as collaborators. And if you think the Viking system of law was a smooth operation, think again. The Viking legal code wasn't perfect. It often led to internal conflicts. Disputes over honor, property, and family could escalate quickly, sometimes resulting in blood feuds. But this very chaos was part of what made the Vikings so dangerous. Even within their own society, the constant pressure to uphold the law kept everyone on edge. A society that constantly challenges itself internally is much harder to predict, and the Vikings used this unpredictability to their advantage. This ability to govern and control their own people gave the Vikings an enemy they could rarely be unified against. While their opponents might have had the numbers, they lacked the cohesion that Viking law and order provided. The more the Vikings enforced their legal system, the more it divided and weakened the coalitions that were formed to resist them. And as their enemies became fractured, the Vikings grew stronger. What made the Vikings even more dangerous was the fact that their legal system was part of their identity. It wasn't just about keeping order, it was about making a statement. The Viking code represented a way of life that was fundamentally different from the feudal and monarchic systems of their enemies. It was a stark reminder that the Vikings were not just invaders, they were here to stay, to reshape the world around them. As we move forward, you'll see how this ability to fracture enemy alliances gave the Vikings a significant strategic advantage, helping them conquer and control vast regions. But for now, remember this: Viking law wasn't just about keeping their own people in check. It was a weapon they wielded to weaken and divide their enemies, making them even more powerful. You've probably heard about the Vikings as the bloodthirsty raiders of history, charging across Europe, destroying villages and claiming treasures. But did you know that their true power wasn't just in their strength or violence? The Vikings were ahead of their time in technology, revolutionizing the tools of war and changing the face of combat. This isn't just about their longships or axes. What if I told you that Viking technology was one of the key reasons they were such formidable enemies? It's a side of the Vikings that's often overshadowed by their reputation for brutality. Today, we'll dive into the unexpected ways the Vikings used innovation to conquer their enemies. Let's start with the Vikings' legendary longship. You've probably seen pictures of these sleek dragon-headed ships, long, narrow boats designed for speed and agility. But there's much more to these ships than meets the eye. They were the Vikings' secret weapon, the key to their ability to travel long distances, raid remote places, and escape without leaving a trace. This was a game-changer in naval warfare. The design of the longship was nothing short of revolutionary. These ships could sail in shallow waters, which allowed them to strike deep into enemy territory far from the coast. They didn't need ports or large harbors to dock. They could land right on the beach, attack, and leave before the enemy had a chance to respond. The longship's speed, combined with its stealth, made it nearly impossible for anyone to predict where or when the Vikings would strike next. Imagine trying to prepare defenses for an enemy that could appear anywhere along 1,000 miles of coastline without warning. It wasn't just their speed, it was their mobility, and that made the Vikings terrifying. But the longship was just the beginning. The Vikings were also masters at creating new weaponry and tools for warfare. One of the most striking innovations was their ability to craft specialized weapons designed for different combat situations. The Viking axe, for instance, was not just a simple tool. It was a weapon of precision, capable of slicing through armor and bone with ease. Unlike other warriors, the Vikings didn't just use brute force. They crafted weapons that allowed them to fight efficiently, no matter the situation. Whether it was an axe for close combat or a spear for throwing from a distance, Viking weapons were designed for versatility and efficiency. And this didn't stop with weapons. The Vikings were also skilled at using their environment to their advantage, crafting tools for war that others hadn't even thought of. Take, for example, their use of the bow and arrow. While many armies relied on heavy, cumbersome bows that were slow to reload, the Vikings used lighter, more portable versions that could be fired quickly and accurately. This allowed them to rain down arrows on unsuspecting foes before they even had a chance to respond. The Viking bow was yet another tool in their arsenal that gave them the edge in battle. And this innovation wasn't just about fighting smarter, it was about overwhelming their enemies with speed and precision. But it wasn't just the Vikings' weapons that set them apart. It was how they applied these innovations to warfare. The Viking approach to combat was calculated, methodical, and ruthless. Unlike many other warrior societies, the Vikings didn't just rely on physical strength. They used their technology, intelligence, and tactics to outmaneuver and outsmart their enemies. Their ability to adapt quickly to new environments also played a major role in their success. Take their raids into Britain, for example. The Vikings didn't just land and attack. They adapted to the environment. They used their technology to infiltrate towns, scaling walls with ease using their specialized tools and weapons. They understood that to conquer their enemies, they had to be as much masters of strategy as they were warriors. And the Vikings didn't stop at military technology. They also brought innovation to everyday life, which further solidified their dominance. Their advancements in shipbuilding, metallurgy, and even agricultural tools allowed them to thrive in even the harshest of conditions. They understood that to maintain their power, they had to adapt to their environment, not just conquer it. Their ability to innovate was integral to their success, not just as warriors, but as a civilization. But there's a strange fact you may not have heard. The Vikings were also responsible for pioneering some of the first true global trade networks. While they were often viewed as brutal raiders, the Vikings were also excellent traders, using their ships to travel vast distances, from the markets of Constantinople to the shores of North America. Their ability to trade goods from all corners of the known world helped them build wealth, which in turn helped fund their raids and innovations. In fact, the Vikings' technological prowess didn't just make them dangerous in battle, it also made them formidable in diplomacy. The wealth they accumulated through trade gave them influence in foreign lands. They didn't always conquer through force. Sometimes they did it through alliances, trading, and even marriage. The Vikings were able to establish strongholds not just by raiding, but by becoming integral parts of the regions they invaded. They knew that to be truly powerful, they had to master both war and peace. And yet, for all their technological advancements, it's easy to think that the Vikings were simply lucky or overpowered. But the truth is that their success was no accident. It wasn't just their weaponry that made them so feared. It was their ability to adapt their innovations to the ever-changing demands of battle, trade, and survival. This ability to innovate in every aspect of their lives, from warfare to diplomacy, made them not just powerful enemies but a lasting influence on history. What makes this even more mind-blowing is that these innovations were passed down through generations, cementing the Viking legacy in the world. Even today, we see echoes of Viking technology in modern shipbuilding, weaponry, and trade practices. The Vikings may have been feared for their raids, but it was their ability to innovate that truly set them apart from other civilizations. In the next section, we'll see how the Vikings used their technological innovations not just for war but to spread their influence and culture across the world. From the shores of Britain to the icy waters of Greenland. Their technological legacy helped shape the course of history in ways you might not expect. But for now, remember, the Vikings weren't just warriors. They were innovators who revolutionized the tools of war, and that made them one of the most dangerous civilizations to ever live. Viking women weren't just homekeepers. They were warriors too. Imagine for a moment a Viking woman standing beside her male counterparts, wielding an axe with the same skill, the same precision, and the same brutal intent. You may think Viking women had little role in battle. After all, most history books paint a picture of Viking warriors as male-dominated, but that's not the full story. Viking women played a crucial, yet often overlooked, role in the Viking world. In some cases, they led raids, fought on the front lines, and earned respect not just in their communities, but across the lands the Vikings conquered. One of the most striking aspects of Viking women was their strength, both physical and societal. Not only did they manage the households while the men were away raiding, but they were also skilled fighters in their own right. The term shield maiden is often used to describe these warriors, and while some argue it was a title only reserved for a select few, there's strong evidence to suggest many Viking women had martial prowess. But it wasn't just physical strength that made them so dangerous, it was their ability to defy the traditional gender roles of their time. Take Lagertha, for instance, the famous shield maiden from the sagas. She wasn't just a warrior in stories. There's historical evidence suggesting she was a real person, a leader in Viking society, who led her warriors into battle. Her story was so compelling that it survived centuries, becoming part of the cultural mythology of the Vikings. But Lagertha wasn't alone. There are other examples of Viking women who not only fought, but also led armies, a rare feat in a world where women typically did not hold positions of military command. This shattered the expectations of Viking enemies and made them fear not just the Viking warriors, but also the women who stood side by side with them in battle. But Viking women didn't just fight in raids. They were also instrumental in the very strategy that made the Vikings so successful. Their presence in battle created an entirely new dynamic for Viking enemies. It forced them to rethink the nature of warfare and made them question their assumptions about who was capable of waging war. When Viking women fought, they fought with the same ferocity and the same strategic thinking as the men, and that was terrifying for enemies who were used to fighting only men on the battlefield. It also created an air of unpredictability for anyone who was about to face the Vikings. After all, no one could predict who might show up to fight. Furthermore, Viking women helped reinforce the Vikings' psychological tactics in battle. The sight of a woman fighting, leading, and commanding could deeply unsettle enemy forces. Women warriors in Viking society were often seen as symbols of strength and resistance. If a woman was willing to take up arms and fight, what did that say about the Vikings as a whole? The message was clear. The Vikings were relentless, and no one, regardless of gender, was safe from their wrath. Now, let's consider a little-known fact that might surprise you. Viking women often took on roles as traders and diplomats too. While many Viking men were away raiding, women managed the family's property, organized trade, and sometimes even negotiated with foreign kings. Their intelligence and savvy in business allowed the Viking people to establish crucial trading routes that spanned vast regions, from the British Isles to Constantinople. This role in trade made them influential not just in battle but in the economy, extending their reach far beyond the shores they controlled. Women were integral to the functioning of Viking society in ways that often go underappreciated. In addition to their leadership roles in battle and trade, Viking women also played a part in their society's religious life. Many Viking women were priestesses, holding power in the spiritual realm as much as the physical one. This connection between spirituality and military might make the Vikings a terrifying force. They were seen as warriors of the gods. Their belief in Valhalla, a place where warriors were honored in the afterlife, pushed them to fight fiercely for glory and honor. But for women, this belief also meant that they too could find a place in the halls of the gods, which was an empowering idea that extended beyond just their earthly battles. Yet despite all this, Viking women are often overlooked in popular depictions of Viking culture. We tend to focus more on the men, the kings, and the warriors, but the women were just as instrumental in the Vikings' success and feared reputation. The presence of Viking women in battle not only challenged societal norms, but also contributed to the fear and mystique that surrounded the Viking raids. It wasn't just the warriors who made the Vikings a powerful enemy. It was the entire Viking society, including the women, who struck terror into the hearts of their enemies. But here's a controversial fact. Many historians would argue that the idea of Viking women as warriors is an exaggerated myth, yet archaeological evidence suggests otherwise. There have been graves uncovered where weapons, armor, and battle gear were found alongside the remains of women. These women were buried as warriors, suggesting they were not only recognized as such but respected for their martial abilities. So while some may dismiss the idea of women warriors in Viking culture as myth, the evidence points to the fact that women were very much involved in Viking warfare. To wrap up, Viking women were more than just background figures in Viking society. They were warriors, leaders, traders, and spiritual guides. Their ability to fight, lead, and influence Viking society added a complex layer to the Vikings' already fearsome reputation. When you think about the Vikings, don't just think of the fierce men of battle. The women who stood beside them made the Vikings a much more terrifying enemy than you may have realized. They defied their era's gender expectations reputations, created fear with their presence in battle, and proved that the Vikings weren't just warriors, they were a force that no one could stand against. You've probably heard about the Vikings and their savage raids, but what if I told you there's more to the Vikings than just bloodthirsty warriors? Their true strength lies in something much deeper. What made the Vikings such powerful enemies wasn't just their brutality in battle. There was a whole psychological element, a ruthless ability to strategize, and an intimidating presence that left an indelible mark on history. Stick around, because today we're going to dive into the 3 insane reasons why the Vikings made such powerful enemies. Reasons you probably didn't expect. By now, you've likely heard the common perception that the Vikings were simply brutal warriors. It's true that they were warriors, but there's more to it. Their use of psychological warfare was incredibly advanced, something many of their enemies never saw coming. While the typical Viking raid seemed chaotic and savage, there was a deeper strategy at play. You see, Vikings didn't just rely on their axes and shields to win battles. They used fear itself as a weapon. This psychological warfare was key to their success. Vikings knew how to instill terror in their enemies long before they even set foot on the battlefield. The famous Viking battle cries weren't just for show. These terrifying sounds were designed to unsettle their enemies and create a sense of panic before they even arrived. Imagine the shock of a village hearing the sound of battle horns in the distance. The Vikings knew that the fear of their brutality often worked in their favor, causing entire communities to crumble before they even saw a single Viking. It wasn't just the strength of the warriors, it was the power of fear itself. And it wasn't just the psychological tactics in battle that made them so dangerous. It was their ability to spread that fear far and wide, creating a reputation that stuck. Stories of Viking raids quickly became the stuff of nightmares. The fear was so pervasive that sometimes just the thought of encountering a Viking warrior was enough to paralyze an entire army. The psychological aspect of Viking warfare ensured that even those who didn't face them directly lived in constant fear of a raid. But fear alone doesn't explain how the Vikings became such a powerful force. Their organization and ability to plan made them even more formidable. You might think of Vikings as wild barbarians, but their success was rooted in something much more calculated. Their raids were not just random attacks. They were meticulously planned and executed with precision. The Vikings understood the importance of surprise, and they used it to their advantage. While other groups might rely on brute force alone, Vikings combined their power with strategy, making them enemies that were nearly impossible to predict. One of the biggest advantages the Vikings had was their longships, a revolutionary design that gave them unmatched mobility. These ships weren't just for travel, they were instruments of war. Their shallow draft allowed them to navigate both open seas and shallow rivers, making surprise raids possible anywhere. They could land, strike fast, and be gone before their enemies had a chance to react. Speed and precision with which they carried out their raids made them a terrifying force to deal with. No matter how big or well defended the target, a Viking raid was unpredictable and fast, an unstoppable force of nature. But the Vikings didn't just rely on their ships and battle cries. They also used intelligence to outsmart their enemies. Unlike many other warriors of the time, Vikings weren't just relying on their strength in battle. They gathered information, they planned, and they used their knowledge of the land and people to make their raids effective. It wasn't just about brute strength. It was about knowing when and where to strike, and knowing exactly how to make their enemies vulnerable. Now, here's a fact that might surprise you. The Vikings were some of the best traders of their time. While they are often remembered for their raids, their influence stretched far beyond warfare. As they raided, they also traded, forming important economic networks across Europe and Asia. Viking trade routes connected distant parts of the world, from the British Isles to the Black Sea. This strategic trading allowed them to gain wealth and power beyond what their enemies could fathom. But what really made the Vikings such powerful enemies wasn't just their ability to attack and raid. It was their ability to adapt. Imagine being an enemy of the Vikings and suddenly finding out that these warriors who were once only raiding are now settling in your territory. The Vikings had the ability to quickly switch from raiding to settling, from warriors to farmers and traders. This adaptability allowed them to gain control over vast areas, which made them a long-term threat, not just a short-term nuisance. This ability to blend in and adapt made the Vikings incredibly unpredictable. They could switch between different ways of life depending on what they needed to do, whether it was conquering, trading, or integrating with local culture. Their adaptability made them hard to pin down, and it's part of what made them so successful as conquerors and settlers. It was this flexibility, this ability to go from raiders to peaceful settlers and back again, that made the Vikings so formidable. You never knew which version of the Viking warrior you were going to face, but perhaps the most frightening aspect of the Vikings was their fearlessness. While many cultures feared death, the Vikings embraced it. Their belief in the afterlife, particularly the idea of being honored in Valhalla, shaped their approach to battle. For the Vikings, death in battle wasn't something to fear, it was something to embrace. The thought of dying and going to Valhalla, where warriors were rewarded for their bravery, pushed them to fight with unmatched courage and intensity. This belief made them fearless in the face of danger, and it made them relentless in battle. Fearlessness was a weapon in itself. Viking warriors would charge into battle without hesitation, knowing that their death would be honored. Their opponents, on the other hand, feared the idea of facing a warrior who wasn't afraid to die. The Viking ability to fight without fear made them even more terrifying to their enemies, who often didn't know how to react to such unrelenting courage. This fearlessness made the Vikings unpredictable and brutal. While other warriors might hesitate or retreat when the battle turned against them, the Vikings pushed forward. Their reputation for being fearless spread, and this fear of Viking warriors became just as dangerous as their battle tactics. So, what made the Vikings such powerful enemies? It wasn't just their strength in battle, it was their ability to use fear as a weapon, their strategic brilliance, and their fearlessness in the face of death. Their ability to adapt, to blend into different societies, and to strike with precision made them unpredictable and deadly. The Vikings didn't just win battles, they shaped the way their enemies viewed war, fear, and death itself. When you faced a Viking, you were not just fighting a warrior, you were facing a force of nature. Was Viking brutality just a myth, or did their reputation for violence actually make them even more dangerous? Or many people believe the Vikings' reputation for savage acts was exaggerated, a tale spun to make them appear more fearsome than they really were. But what if I told you their violent image wasn't just a myth? What if that very reputation played a central role in their ability to dominate and terrorize entire regions? The Vikings' reputation for brutality didn't simply come from their ruthless raids, it became an essential part of their strategy. Their violent acts weren't just about conquest, they were a form of psychological warfare. In fact, the more brutal they were, the more powerful their reputation became. It was a vicious cycle. The Vikings became even more feared, and the more they were feared, the easier it became to win. Let's break down how this reputation worked to their advantage. Imagine being in a neighboring village, just living your life, when suddenly you hear the telltale sounds of Viking longships approaching. Vikings weren't just skilled warriors, they were masters of fear. The terrifying reputation they had built through years of brutal raids meant that their mere presence struck panic into the hearts of their enemies. This panic often led to poor decision-making, and in battle, when your opponent is caught off guard, that's when the Vikings struck hardest. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Vikings didn't always need to do the fighting themselves to win. Their reputation alone often preempted conflict. When rumors spread of Viking ships approaching, entire towns would surrender without a fight, believing that the savagery that followed a Viking raid was inevitable. For the Vikings, it was a two-pronged strategy: terrorize with reputation and finish the job with overwhelming force. But why was this reputation so effective? It wasn't just about attacking villages and taking treasure. The Vikings would often desecrate what they raided, burning down homes, killing livestock, and taking captives for ransom or sacrifice. These actions, though horrific, became synonymous with Viking raids. They were calculated to make their enemies fear what came next, even when no Viking had yet stepped ashore. It worked because it gave the Vikings the upper hand in the psychological game of warfare. The idea of what the Vikings might do was often worse than the raid itself. But here's a controversial thought. Many of the atrocities we associate with Viking raids were as much about spreading fear as they were about gaining wealth or land. In fact, some historians argue that the Vikings were far less interested in land than they were in establishing an aura of terror that would give them leverage in negotiations and even in their day-to-day dealings. Imagine you're a king or a lord of a rival tribe, and you've just heard that a Viking raid is coming your way. You've heard the stories of villages completely decimated, the helpless women and children taken as slaves, and the fearless Viking warriors who stopped at nothing. What do? More often than not, you give them what they want: gold, land, or anything else, just to make sure you don't become the next target. In this way, their reputation for brutality became self-perpetuating, and they rarely had to fight for what they wanted. The fear of Viking savagery had already won half the battle. What's more, Viking brutality didn't just terrify their immediate enemies, it also created an everlasting image that would continue to spread long after their raids ended. Even today, the Viking image evokes a sense of raw power and uncontrollable violence. Modern media still depicts Vikings as brutal, bloodthirsty warriors, and part of the reason for that is because they cultivated this very image to their advantage. They understood the power of their reputation, and they used it like a weapon. Now here's a strange fact that might make you rethink how we see Vikings. Did you know that Vikings often preferred to negotiate for tribute rather than raid? As strange as it sounds, once their reputation was established, they didn't always want to fight, they just wanted the tribute. The terror they spread through their raids and their reputation for cruelty made it easier to get what they wanted without the need for violent conquest. In many ways, their reputation was their most effective weapon. But what made their brutality so effective was not just that it made enemies cower, it also made Viking forces feel invincible. This mindset became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more the Vikings believed in their own power, the more it manifested in their raids. Viking warriors became so convinced of their own dominance that it propelled them into even more savage acts. This was a key component of their success. Their belief in their own invincibility fueled their fearlessness, which in turn fueled more terror among their enemies. The cycle of brutality and fear wasn't just limited to the battlefield. It extended to the way the Vikings interacted with their neighbors and other civilizations. Communities feared the Vikings so much that they would go to great lengths to avoid conflict with them. Local leaders were often too scared to stand up to the Vikings, preferring to submit and offer tribute rather than risk the wrath of the Viking forces. And there's a strange twist in this story. The more brutal the Vikings were, the more others came to expect it, creating an almost mythical reputation. Over time, the Vikings became became less real warriors and more like a force of nature. The idea of a Viking raid became something that people feared almost instinctively. This image of the Viking as an unstoppable force was not only terrifying, it was also incredibly effective in securing the Vikings' dominance over large parts of Europe and beyond. But as we uncover these layers of Viking power, we start to realize something surprising. The reputation they so carefully crafted didn't just make their enemies fear them, it also made their allies and subjects more loyal. When a Viking king or warrior was feared, it brought order and stability within their own ranks. Loyalty to Viking leaders was maintained not only by force, but by the ever-present knowledge that to cross a Viking leader was to court disaster. The vicious cycle of reputation, fear, and brutality fed itself. With each raid, with each new story of horror, the Vikings cemented their status as one of the most feared groups in history. They didn't just build an empire, they built a legacy of terror that lasted for centuries. Even today, that legacy is alive and well, reminding us that fear, when wielded correctly, can be one of the most powerful tools a warrior or a civilization can use. In the end, the Vikings weren't just savage warriors, they were masters of the psychological game, using their brutal reputation to dominate not just through violence, but through the sheer terror of what they represented. How did the Vikings always seem to know exactly where to strike? Could it be that they had a secret intelligence network? Many people assume that Viking raids were chaotic and disorganized, a bunch of warriors just rushing in to pillage wherever they could. But what if I told you the Vikings weren't just raiders? They were experts in gathering information, knowing their enemies' weaknesses before they even landed on shore. In fact, the Vikings were incredibly strategic about their raids, and a big part of that was thanks to their exceptional intelligence networks. They didn't just attack random targets. No, they gathered information from traders, spies, and even other raiders. They knew where the weak spots were, who had the most valuable resources, and when those places were most vulnerable. Their ability to gather intelligence made Viking raids not just brutal but highly calculated. What made the Vikings stand out was how well they could plan. And the longship appeared on the horizon. It wasn't the result of a random decision. It was the culmination of detailed information collected from many sources. They would track the movement of goods, monitor trade routes, and listen to gossip in neighboring settlements. A village might not even realize that the Vikings had their eyes on them until it was too late. But here's where it gets more interesting. The Vikings didn't always have to rely on spies embedded within other societies. They were experts at using the very systems of the societies they targeted to their advantage. The Vikings would listen to local traders and travelers, gathering crucial bits of information that would allow them to plan their next move. They could tell when a village was particularly rich, when a kingdom was struggling with internal conflicts, or when a region was short on troops because of war elsewhere. And yet, here's a surprising fact. While we think of Vikings as just warriors, their intelligence networks often included more than just fellow raiders. In some cases, they would use their relationships with local farmers and traders as a form of espionage. These individuals had access to information that the Vikings could use, and they didn't always realize that they were being used as intelligence sources. Imagine being a farmer, casually talking about your land or the ships you saw docked at a nearby port. Vikings could have been listening, gathering the info they needed to launch their next successful raid. The intelligence network wasn't just about finding targets, though. It was also about knowing exactly when and where to strike. This precision gave the Vikings a major advantage in battle. They would hit their targets when they were least prepared, often during holidays, festivals, or at night when the villagers were relaxed. By knowing their targets' routines, the Vikings maximized the element of surprise, which made their raids far more effective and, frankly, terrifying. But there's something more to this network. It wasn't just a system that allowed the Vikings to strike effectively. It also gave them a sense of control over the chaos they created. They didn't just rely on brute force. They relied on strategy and intelligence to get what they wanted, and often that was wealth and land without much resistance. Imagine being a rival warlord, knowing that the Vikings were coming, but not knowing when or where they would strike next. The uncertainty of that alone was enough to make anyone paranoid and fearful, and it gave the Vikings a psychological edge. Here's the controversial part. Viking raids weren't just about plundering. They were about outsmarting their enemies. The Vikings didn't need to overwhelm their enemies with sheer force all the time. They just needed to catch them off guard, and with their intelligence networks, they could ensure that they always had the upper hand. In fact, it's possible that many Viking raids were more about creating a sense of chaos and fear than about taking spoils. They wanted to break down the morale of their enemies, and a well-timed raid fueled by precise intelligence was an effective way to do that. Let's throw in an interesting tidbit. Did you know that Vikings didn't just use spies from their own ranks? They would occasionally use spies from the enemy's side too. This form of intelligence gathering was one of the reasons why Vikings were able to stay one step ahead. Imagine an enemy trader feeding them information. It was a level of infiltration that many other warrior groups at the time couldn't match. It wasn't just brute force that made the Vikings terrifying. It was their ability to be everywhere, to see everything. And as strange as it sounds, their ability to gather intelligence wasn't just confined to their immediate raiding areas. Vikings were experts at navigating through enemy territories and collecting information on the go. Long-distance trading routes gave them access to information that their enemies couldn't even fathom. They could gather secrets from distant lands, bringing bringing them back to inform future raids. This network of knowledge made them far more dangerous than anyone could anticipate. They weren't just raiding, they were playing a much larger, more complex game of strategy. The ultimate takeaway here is that Viking raids weren't just about violent, chaotic invasions. They were meticulously planned with incredible precision, thanks to their vast intelligence networks. It was this combination of terror and tactical superiority that made the Vikings such powerful and feared enemies, and it was their ability to outsmart their enemies that truly set them apart from other groups of the time. So, next time you think of the Vikings as simple, barbaric raiders, remember this: their greatest weapon wasn't just their axes or swords, it was the information they had and how they used it to strike fear and control the very people they raided. How did the Vikings always seem to know exactly where to strike? Could it be that they had a secret intelligence network? While most people picture Viking raids as chaotic rampages, the reality is far more strategic. The Vikings didn't simply stumble upon their targets. No, they knew exactly where to strike, often with chilling precision. This wasn't by chance. This was the result of an intricate intelligence network that gave them a distinct advantage over their enemies. Think about it. How could such a small, mobile force of raiders strike with such accuracy year after year? How did they always seem to know the most vulnerable targets, the locations with the most wealth, or the moments when their enemies would be the least prepared? It wasn't just their brute strength that made them so feared. It was their cunning and the intelligence they gathered. Now, you might think of spies as a modern invention, something we associate with movies and covert operations. But the Vikings, they had their own network of spies, traitors, and informants. They didn't just rely on their own raids. They gathered information from a wide variety of sources. Traitors traveling between lands, local informants, even the very people they conquered, often gave up secrets about their own weaknesses without realizing it. Imagine being a farmer or a merchant, having a casual conversation about troop movements or supply routes, only to find out later that the Vikings had been listening, gathering intel that would allow them to strike when it mattered most. What's fascinating is that their intelligence wasn't just about knowing where to strike. It was about understanding the political and social dynamics of their enemies. The Vikings were keenly aware of who was in power, which kingdoms were weak, and which were fighting internal battles. They used this knowledge to their advantage, knowing when a kingdom was distracted by civil unrest or a leadership struggle. Now, here's the controversial part. The Vikings didn't always rely solely on their own people for intelligence. They would often exploit existing trade routes and networks that were already in place. These routes, controlled by traders, carried not only goods but also gossip, information that the Vikings could use. Traders weren't just exchanging commodities, they were exchanging knowledge, whether they knew it or not. The Vikings would have been able to tap into this network, learning about which cities had the most treasure, which villages were poorly defended, and where their enemies were most vulnerable. Think about it for a second. The Vikings didn't have satellites or advanced technology, but they had something even more valuable: the human network. They used the movements of people, goods, and information to plan their raids with staggering accuracy. They knew how to use everything around them: human interaction, social structures, and even the physical geography of the land to their advantage. Their ability to gather intelligence was unparalleled in the context of their time. Another point that's often overlooked is the fact that the Vikings understood the psychological impact of surprise. By using their intelligence, they could choose when and where to strike, keeping their enemies on edge, never knowing when or where the next attack would come. This unpredictability made the Vikings not just a military threat, but a psychological one as well. Their reputation for surprise and brutality preceded them, but the element of fear and uncertainty, amplified by their intelligence network, made them even more terrifying. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Viking raids weren't always about brute force or even treasure. In many cases, the raids were more strategic, focused on weakening their enemies by creating fear and instability. By knowing the weaknesses of their enemies, the Vikings didn't just attack, they destabilized entire regions, making it impossible for their foes to recover. This is where their intelligence network paid off. By undermining the very foundation of their enemy's power, they ensured that they didn't just win battles, they won the war. Here's a rare fact that might surprise you. The Vikings often targeted isolated, vulnerable spots, sometimes with a particular focus on religious sites like monasteries. These were considered soft targets, places where there was little to no defense. Monasteries, especially those in the British Isles, were a treasure trove of wealth and resources, and their lack of military protection made them easy prey. But the Vikings didn't just stumble upon these spots. They knew exactly where these religious sites were located and how to strike when their guards were at their weakest. This wasn't random, it was strategic intelligence at work. And finally, there's a somewhat controversial truth. The Vikings were masters of psychological warfare. They knew that fear was just as powerful as a sword. The intelligence they gathered didn't just inform their raids, it informed how they conducted them. When they arrived, they didn't just attack, they terrified. Their reputation preceded them, and this was all part of the plan. The more fear they instilled, the more likely their enemies were to crumble without even putting up a fight. The Vikings' ability to gather and use intelligence made them not just powerful warriors, but brilliant strategists. They used information as a weapon, and they wielded it with precision, making them far more dangerous than most people realize. Their raids weren't just about plunder, they were about outsmarting their enemies, creating fear, and ensuring that every strike was a step toward domination. So next time you think about the Vikings, remember remember, their success wasn't just about their ferocity, it was about their ability to gather intelligence, plan with precision, and strike when their enemies least expected it. What's the connection between Viking raids and the use of hostages? You might be surprised to learn that Vikings didn't just raid for treasure or territory, they often took hostages, and these hostages weren't just bargaining chips for ransom. No, the Vikings had a far more insidious reason for capturing people, and it played a key role in their reign of terror across Europe. Think about it, when we imagine Viking raids, we usually think of them as being driven by pure violence and the search for wealth. But there's another side to their warfare strategy that's often overlooked, the strategic use of hostages. These weren't random kidnappings. They were calculated moves designed to destabilize their enemies and create a constant state of fear. At first glance, the Vikings might seem like savage raiders, but when you dig a little deeper, you see a much more methodical and psychological approach to warfare. Taking hostages wasn't just about holding someone for ransom. It was about control, fear, and disruption. Taking key individuals, whether they were important civilians, local leaders, or even wealthy merchants, the Vikings effectively crippled their enemies. These hostages kept their captors in a constant state of anxiety, not knowing when or where their loved ones might be struck down. In many cases, these hostages were also used to create divisions within the enemy ranks. Imagine the pressure it would put on a local ruler or noble to know that their family was in Viking hands, or worse, their most trusted allies were now hostages. Vikings could use this fear to create tension and uncertainty, even amongst their own allies. This is a type of psychological warfare that's often overlooked, but it was incredibly effective. What's even more fascinating is how the Vikings used hostages to further manipulate the people they captured. These hostages weren't just sitting ducks, they were used as political tools, often forced to swear loyalty to Viking rulers or be threatened with execution. This forced loyalty meant that the Vikings gained not only the fear of their enemies, but also new, reluctant allies. Here's a rare fact that may surprise you. Viking raids were often timed not just for wealth, but for the opportunity to destabilize entire regions. By seizing hostages, they could disrupt trade, create uncertainty, and cause entire communities to fold. It's said that Viking raids sometimes had less to do with outright destruction and more to do with undermining the very fabric of society. They would kidnap enough people to make it impossible for their victims to organize resistance. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. The Vikings understood that fear wasn't just about brute strength or the threat of death. They knew that the fear of losing loved ones was far more powerful. Hostages became symbols of the Vikings' power and control. They didn't need to kill everyone they captured. They needed their enemies to fear that they could at any moment, and that alone would keep them in line. But the Vikings also used this tactic to their advantage in more tactical ways. Hostages were often exchanged or used in negotiations for land, gold, or even alliances. This gave the Vikings leverage not just in battle, but in politics. The threat of harm to a key person could sway decisions and turn the tide of negotiations in their favor. And here's a controversial point. Many of the Viking hostages weren't just women or children. They were leaders, warriors, and warriors' families. Some Viking chieftains would send their own sons or daughters to act as hostages in foreign lands, knowing that this act would bind their enemies through a mutual understanding of fear. This wasn't a tactic of desperation. It was a tactic of calculated diplomacy, executed with as much precision as any battle strategy. Think about it. By taking hostages, the Vikings were able to not only raid, but also control vast swathes of territory without having to station large armies in every region. Hostages served as a constant reminder of Viking power, often enough to break any potential resistance before it even began. When you consider the immense fear and stress created by these tactics, you start to understand why the Vikings were able to stay ahead of their enemies and build their reputation as nearly unstoppable forces. The Vikings knew exactly how to break their enemy's spirit without a sword. They created a web of fear that was far more effective than any army could ever be. Hostages weren't just the spoils of war. They were part of the strategy, the backbone of their terrifying efficiency. Without them, it's possible that the Vikings wouldn't have been able to maintain the level of control they did over their vast empire. The threat of violence alone would not have been enough. The strategic use of human lives ensured that their enemies were not just physically defeated, but mentally and politically broken. But what happens when you see the very human cost of this tactic? It's easy to think of hostages as mere pawns in a larger game of conquest. But imagine for a moment the terror and helplessness of those who were taken, and the toll it would have on the families left behind. The Vikings were ruthless, but their methodical approach made them one of the most feared forces in history. In the end, the Vikings didn't just win battles, they turned human lives into tools of war. And this is why, for centuries, their raids left a scar on the world. The ability to capture, control, and manipulate, using hostages as a psychological weapon, was a masterstroke that cemented the Vikings' legacy as some of the most formidable enemies to ever walk the earth. So, next time you think of the Vikings, remember, it wasn't just their physical prowess that made them feared. It was their ability to create fear on a scale that stretched far beyond the battlefield. By holding people, not just land, as their most powerful weapon, Vikings were masters of surprise attacks, an art form they perfected to an extraordinary level. But how did they manage to strike fear into the hearts of so many with such lightning speed and brutal efficiency? The Vikings didn't just show up on a battlefield and hope for the best. They planned every attack with precision and timing that would make even the most seasoned generals wary. Imagine this, you're sitting in a peaceful village, the wind rustling through the trees, the sun shining, and out of nowhere a fleet of Viking ships appears on the horizon. By the time you can even sound the alarm, they're already upon you, raiding your homes, taking valuables, and capturing people before you even know what's happened. The Vikings' ability to hit swiftly and vanish without a trace was unmatched. But why was this their go-to tactic? The Vikings understood that surprise wasn't just an advantage, it was a weapon. They knew that striking when their enemies were least prepared was the key to their dominance. But it wasn't just about speed, it was also about planning. They would often launch their attacks during times of vulnerability, during the night, on holidays, or when people were gathered for celebrations. The element of surprise meant that their enemies were caught off guard, and by the time they organized any form of defense, it was already too late. Now here's the twist that most people overlook. The Vikings didn't just use surprise attacks in battle, they used them to create a constant state of terror. The psychological impact of never knowing when or where the Vikings would strike was enough to keep entire kingdoms on edge. Imagine the constant anxiety that would build up in a community that knew it was only a matter of time before Viking longships appeared again. This fear made it harder for people to rally together and form a strong defense. It wasn't just a physical threat, it was a mental one as well. Take a moment to consider this rare fact. The Viking raids weren't just a random series of violent attacks. They were carefully timed psychological operations designed to sow chaos and disruption. It gets even more interesting when you consider their strategy of surprise in combination with their quick withdrawal. Vikings were trained to hit hard and fast, and just as quickly retreat. After a raid, they didn't stick around to fight prolonged battles. They disappeared as quickly as they arrived. This hit-and-run approach made them unpredictable, which gave them an enormous advantage. When you never knew when the next attack was coming, your ability to defend yourself was severely hampered. This ability to vanish into the mist after a successful raid wasn't just about tactics, it was part of their identity. The Vikings built their reputation on the fear of the unknown. They became legends in part because of the sheer unpredictability of their movements. Their enemies never knew if the Vikings were gone for good, or if they were simply lying in wait, ready to strike again. But here's where things get really fascinating. Vikings weren't just tactical geniuses. They understood the power of perception. They didn't just want to win battles, they wanted to control the narrative. By using surprise tactics, they made themselves seem like unstoppable forces. This reputation worked in their favor, as it made their enemies more likely to surrender or panic at the first signs of a raid. Now, here's something controversial. Many historians argue that the Vikings weren't as brutal as they were made out to be. While their raids were undoubtedly violent, their ability to strike fear into their enemies without constant bloodshed was what truly made them formidable. In a way, the psychological warfare they waged through surprise attacks was far more dangerous than any weapon. Let's pause here for a second and think about how powerful that psychological warfare truly was. Imagine you're a Viking warrior, and you're part of a group that's been trained to strike fast, disappear, and leave your enemies terrified. You're not just a warrior, you're part of a psychological operation. You're not just conquering land, you're conquering minds. And it wasn't just the fear of death that caused panic, it was the uncertainty of when the next attack would come, or where it would hit. Its ability to make surprise attacks their trademark, and to withdraw swiftly, helped them control not just territories but entire populations. People lived in constant fear, unsure of when the Vikings would come to claim their next prize. And when you're constantly in fear, it's hard to fight back effectively. But there's a strange fact here. The Vikings were actually quite sophisticated in how they used surprise. They didn't just rely on brute force, they understood the terrain and used it to their advantage. Their longships, which could navigate both the open sea and shallow rivers, allowed them to appear in places no one expected. In fact, there were instances where the Vikings launched attacks so fast that their enemies didn't even have time to react. By the time they had raised the alarm, the Vikings were already long gone, with treasure and captives in tow. So, what made these raids so effective? It wasn't just speed or surprise, it was the combination of both, executed with military precision. The Vikings didn't just show up, they controlled the environment. They attacked with such force and suddenness that their enemies had little time to regroup. This made Viking raids incredibly difficult to defend against. And it's this ability to control the narrative through fear and surprise that made the Vikings such powerful enemies. Now, you might be thinking, sure, but didn't they eventually face pushback? Yes, they did. But the core principle of surprise and unpredictability never truly left them. Even as they began to settle and build kingdoms, their ability to remain an unpredictable force contributed to their enduring legacy as one of history's most fearsome enemies. The Vikings didn't just win battles, they created an atmosphere of fear that lasted long after the battle was over. The psychological impact of their surprise attacks haunted their enemies for generations, and it's why their raids continue to be remembered as some of the most terrifying in history. Their ability to strike fast, vanish without a trace, and leave behind a wake of fear made them not just warriors, but legends. And it's this unpredictable terror that solidified their place in history as one of the most powerful and feared forces of the medieval world. Vikings were known for their fearsome raids, but their ability to win battles and conquer territories was not purely due to brute force. One of their most powerful tools was their ability to form strategic alliances with mercenaries and other cultures. encounters. This often went unnoticed by those who only viewed the Vikings as lone warriors or raiders. At first glance, you might picture Vikings as isolated, independent warriors who attacked on their own, but in reality, they were master tacticians, frequently forging alliances with mercenaries from other cultures. These mercenaries, often from lands far beyond Scandinavia, would join Viking forces in exchange for loot or a share of the spoils. This tactic gave the Vikings an edge, not just in numbers, but in expertise. These allied forces could be utilized in different situations, adding layers to Viking military operations. But why would mercenaries agree to fight alongside the Vikings? The answer lies in the Vikings' ability to adapt their strategies and make alliances that worked for all parties involved. Vikings were not just fierce raiders, they were pragmatic, willing to recruit skilled warriors to increase their chances of success. This made them more powerful than their enemies expected. Imagine a Viking raid where not only the feared Norse warriors were involved, but also foreign warriors with different skills and fighting styles. This combination of strength and diversity in tactics was something Viking enemies had a difficult time countering. Interestingly, some of these mercenaries came from cultures that had long been at odds with the Vikings. The Vikings were known for their raids into Eastern Europe, and in some cases, they allied with Slavic and other Eastern European warriors. The lure of Viking wealth and the promise of a share in the spoils made such alliances possible. Despite the cultural differences, the Vikings' ability to forge these relationships and create alliances with mercenaries gave them more fighting power without exhausting their own resources. This strategy of using outside forces wasn't limited to just warriors. Vikings also had connections with traders, explorers, and even other kingdoms. These alliances were not just about brute strength, they were about creating networks of influence that could be leveraged during raids. The ability to call on a network of support meant that Vikings didn't just face isolated battles, they often had reinforcements and intelligence from unexpected sources. Imagine an enemy kingdom preparing for a Viking attack, only to learn that a group of mercenaries within their own borders had already pledged loyalty to the Vikings. The strategic alliances Vikings formed also had the benefit of creating a network of spies and informants. The Vikings understood that information was just as valuable as weapons. By creating alliances and networks across Europe, they gained crucial intelligence on the movements of enemy forces. This allowed them to plan raids with remarkable precision, often striking at the most vulnerable moments when their enemies were unprepared. If they needed to know about the movements of a distant enemy or the strength of a fortress, the Vikings had their connections to provide the inside scoop. However, the controversial fact here is that some of the Vikings' greatest victories were achieved not through brute force, but through these carefully calculated alliances. This method was not always honorable in the eyes of their enemies, but it was incredibly effective. It led to Viking success in battles and raids, even against much larger and more established armies. A rare insight into Viking tactics is that their ability to recruit mercenaries and form alliances was one of the key factors in the Viking expansion beyond the traditional Viking homelands of Scandinavia. They didn't just raid and pillage, they created lasting relationships with the people they encountered, sometimes leaving behind settlements and forming new political ties. The Vikings understood that their reach could extend far beyond their raiding ships if they forged strategic partnerships. But what really set the Vikings apart was their ability to negotiate and manage relationships with mercenaries. They weren't just warriors, they were also shrewd leaders who understood the power of diplomacy. They used these alliances to their advantage, ensuring that their mercenaries were motivated by the promise of wealth and status. This made Viking raids not just a test of physical strength, but also a demonstration of their political acumen. What makes this even more intriguing is that the Vikings' strategic use of mercenaries and alliances wasn't just a temporary advantage. It had long-term implications for Viking culture and influence. While many people know the Vikings as barbaric raiders, their true power lay in their ability to integrate with and manipulate other cultures to their advantage. This combination of warfare and diplomacy allowed them to thrive as a dominant force for hundreds of years. So, was it the Viking warriors' prowess alone that made them such powerful enemies? Not entirely. It was their ability to create and maintain a network of allies that gave them the upper hand in ways that were both surprising and terrifying to their enemies. They didn't just conquer through strength, they conquered through relationships and alliances, building an empire of influence that was far more expansive than most people realize. This ability to form alliances, whether with mercenaries, traders, or other kingdoms, was one of the hidden strategies that made the Vikings not just warriors, but one of the most powerful and enduring forces in European history. Their success in building relationships was as crucial as their success in battle, and in the end, it's what allowed them to continue their raids and their influence long after many believed they would have fallen. The Vikings' strategic alliances were a significant reason why they were feared, respected, and remembered throughout history. Their legacy wasn't just about the bloodshed. They were tacticians who understood the value of networking, diplomacy, and creating bonds that made them an even greater force than anyone ever expected. Vikings didn't just raid and pillage, they created a reputation for being savage warriors. But it wasn't just brute force that made them such powerful enemies. One of their most potent strategies was cultivating their savage image. They knew that fear could be just as powerful as an axe in battle. You see, Vikings Vikings understood the psychological power of terror. They didn't just strike their enemies physically, they struck them mentally. By intentionally crafting a brutal and merciless image, they made enemies fear them before the first blow was even landed. In fact, some Viking raids were so feared that entire villages would surrender at the first sign of Viking longships on the horizon. The sight of those ships was enough to send most lean in panic. This reputation didn't come about by accident. Vikings often destroyed or desecrated villages not just for plunder but to send a clear message: resist us and you'll suffer. They made examples of towns they attacked, leaving behind burning homes, looted treasures, and the psychological scar of defeat. The idea was simple: the more ruthless they appeared, the less likely anyone would dare to resist them. But there's more to this savage reputation than mere violence. It was a carefully planned psychological weapon. Imagine this: you're a king, a powerful ruler of your land, and suddenly you hear the rumors. Vikings are coming on what they're capable of: brutality, destruction, terror. But it's not just what you've heard. It's the stories of their past attacks, the horrific acts of violence that have been exaggerated over time, turning them into mythical monsters. The more brutal they were, the more fear they instilled. Their name alone became enough to weaken the resolve of those who might otherwise resist them. The Vikings were fierce warriors, known for their ruthless tactics, but the reality of Viking raids was often more calculated than mere bloodlust. The fear they spread before they even arrived was a powerful weapon. Some historians argue that Vikings didn't just make their enemies fear them, they also used this fear to control their surroundings, manipulate decisions, and bend people to their will. But there was a deeper layer to this reputation. It wasn't just about scaring their enemies, it was about empowering themselves. When the Vikings made their raids, they made sure the world knew who they were. They didn't just want to conquer a village, they wanted to solidify their reputation as the most feared warriors in Europe. This reputation was self-reinforcing, and it worked. The more terrifying they became, the more they were able to achieve with minimal effort. This constant reminder of their brutality became part of Viking identity. It wasn't just something they displayed in battle, it was ingrained in their culture, part of the very fabric of Viking life. Their warriors were often raised to embrace this image of brutality, which gave them a psychological edge over their enemies. The Vikings didn't just raid, they raided with an awareness of their own reputation. The act of being feared became part of the Viking method of warfare. The Vikings made sure their terror would reach beyond their immediate conquests. Their raids were calculated to be loud, aggressive, and impossible to ignore. The message was always clear: resist us, and there will be consequences far worse than death. Over time, their image grew into something much larger than any single raid, a symbol of untamed power and dominance that echoed across Europe. Here's a strange fact: Viking warriors weren't just feared for their actions, they were also feared for the psychological toll their presence took. The anxiety, the constant fear that an attack could come at any moment, was as dangerous as the physical attacks themselves. Enemies lived in a perpetual state of terror, which affected not just their ability to fight, but also their ability to think clearly. One of the most interesting aspects of the Viking use of fear was how they blended it with their strategic and tactical brilliance. Vikings didn't simply rely on brute force and terror. They understood the psychological advantages of making their enemies second-guess themselves. By the time the Vikings arrived at a target, their enemies were already beaten psychologically. This gave them a massive advantage in battle, making it easier for them to achieve victories with less resistance. Now let's talk about the darker side of this. It wasn't just the enemy that feared them. Vikings too played into the fear they created. Their warriors were bred into the culture of terror. The more ruthless they became, the more they embraced this dark image as part of their own identity. But did this work in their favor? Absolutely. The Vikings were as feared by their own as they were by others. The way they cultivated and maintained their savage reputation meant they didn't have to fight as much as other armies. Enemies were intimidated into submission, making many Viking raids more of a psychological victory than a physical one. This is what made their legacy so enduring. They didn't just conquer, they left behind a trail of fear and terror that shaped how future generations viewed them. But was this image of brutality always the truth? No. As history shows, the Vikings were not just savages. They were also traders, settlers, and even law-abiding citizens in their own communities. Yet their violent reputation became so dominant that it overshadowed everything else. The irony here is that while they were fierce and deadly, they were also brilliant strategists who used fear as a tool to conquer both lands and minds. And here's where it gets really intriguing. The fear they created didn't die with them. Even today, the Viking image, powerful, ruthless, and unstoppable, is still part of popular culture. It's used to symbolize strength, toughness, and resilience. That legacy is far more than just the sum of their raids. It's a testament to how the Vikings understood the power of fear and used it to leave an indelible mark on history. So, the next time you think of the Vikings, remember, it wasn't just their strength that made them so feared. It was their ability to wield fear itself, turning it into one of their most powerful weapons. Their reputation didn't just precede them, it shaped the very course of history, making them enemies that no one could easily forget. Viking warriors didn't just have a reputation for being fearsome fighters, they crafted an image of savagery that made them a terrifying force for centuries. But what if I told you that this image wasn't just a byproduct of their ruthless raids? It was something they actively created. The Vikings understood the power of fear in ways that modern armies rarely grasp, and it became one of their most deadly weapons. But it wasn't just that they wanted to seem brutal. They used their savage reputation as a tool, a weapon, the kind of weapon that forces enemies into submission before a single sword is swung. Imagine being the leader of a village, hearing whispers that Vikings are near. You don't see them yet, but the mere thought fills your warriors with dread. That fear could have already doomed you. It wasn't just their fighting skill. It was the fear they inspired that made them one of the most powerful enemies anyone could face. Now, let's dig deeper into this. What made them so skilled in using fear to their advantage? Vikings knew exactly how to use their fearsome reputation as psychological warfare. Their raids weren't just about looting and conquering. They were designed to unsettle and destroy their enemies' morale before the fighting even began. They weren't interested in just killing. They wanted to. The Vikings would often use terrifying battle cries, amplified by their appearance. Fur-clad warriors, some wearing horned helmets, even though they didn't actually wear these in battle, would descend on villages like phantoms of doom. The mere sound of their arrival was enough to send enemies into a panic, rendering them unable to resist or even properly defend themselves. Imagine the psychological impact. Most foes were already paralyzed by fear, and by the time the Vikings arrived, many had already given up. They didn't need to fight as much as they needed to instill fear. Often, surrender was the only option left for their enemies. But that wasn't the full picture. Vikings were experts at controlling and manipulating the narrative surrounding them. The brutality of their raids was legendary, and they made sure their enemies never forgot it. After a raid, they didn't just leave a field of corpses. They left behind stories of unspeakable violence. Villages burned to the ground, entire populations wiped out. The fear of becoming the next target was more powerful than any physical attack. Now, I know what you're thinking. Couldn't this reputation have been exaggerated? After all, who wouldn't be afraid of a ruthless enemy? But here's the thing. The Vikings not only embraced their reputation, they enhanced it. By continuing their ruthless tactics, they built a cycle of fear that kept their enemies in line. The more violent they appeared, the more their enemies would tremble at the thought of facing them. It wasn't just the violence itself that made them feared. It was the consistent reinforcement of that fear. The more they earned their reputation as savages, the easier it became to intimidate others into submission. This isn't just some exaggeration or myth. The Vikings understood that fear itself could be as deadly as any weapon they wielded. It's a controversial idea, right? Most people think that a warrior's might come solely from their strength, their weapons, their prowess in battle. But for the Vikings, it was about much more than that. They understood the value of mental warfare, getting into the minds of their enemies and making them afraid to fight. And this fear didn't just extend to the people they fought. It was internal too. Within their own ranks, the Vikings cultivated an image of brutal warriors, and this encouraged a warrior culture that was feared not just by outsiders, but by their own society. They believed that fearlessness and a savage reputation were integral to their identity. Their warriors were not just brave, they were designed to be terrifying, and this image was something they took great pride in. This reputation wasn't a passive byproduct. It was a carefully cultivated weapon, honed with every raid, every battle, and every act of brutality. So, while the Vikings may have been fierce warriors, what made them so formidable wasn't just their fighting skills. It was the fear that followed them wherever they went. Here's a strange thought. What if the fear that Vikings created around their name was more powerful than the violence they actually inflicted? Think about it. If their enemies were too frightened to fight back, if the very thought of a Viking raid sent them into disarray, then the Vikings had already won. It wasn't about the number of people they killed. It was about how many they scared into submission without ever raising a sword. But there's another twist to this story. The Vikings didn't just spread fear through their violence. They used it to create divisions among their enemies, which made it even easier for them to dominate. The terror surrounding Viking raids often kept kingdoms and villages from uniting against them. It was easier for Viking leaders to manipulate rival groups, knowing that the shared fear of the Vikings would often prevent alliances from forming. Imagine trying to coordinate an alliance to fend off an enemy that not only attacks with brutal force, but also has the ability to break you mentally before you even face them. The Vikings didn't just dominate with power, they dominated through a carefully planned strategy that made resistance nearly impossible. But here's something even more fascinating. Vikings weren't just about destroying their enemies. They knew when to stop, when to retreat, and how to use terror strategically. Their raids were not about pointless violence. Every Viking raid had a purpose, a clear goal, and the psychological warfare was as calculated as the physical tactics. This made them nearly unstoppable, because not only did their enemies fear their brutality, but they also feared the very idea of facing them. Fear, in a way, became the Vikings' most powerful weapon, surpassing even their strength and numbers. When you think about it, the Vikings were brilliant tacticians who used the one thing most people overlook, the power of fear. They understood that while a sword might win a battle, fear could win a war, and in a world where brutal warriors were the norm, it was their ability to control fear that made them the most powerful enemies the world had ever seen. Their legacy of fear isn't just ancient history, though. Today, when you hear the term Viking, what do you think of? Strength, brutality, power? All these qualities are linked to the legacy they created. The fear they instilled, the reputation they built, still lives on. The Vikings didn't just create terror in their time. They crafted a legacy of fear that still resonates with us today. Vikings didn't just conquer lands and defeat armies. They built an empire of fear, and that fear was their most powerful weapon. But what made the Vikings such formidable enemies wasn't just their axes, shields, or even their ferociousness in battle. It was the ability to take over minds. They didn't just attack villages or raid towns. They made their enemies feel the terror long before their longships appeared on the horizon. In a world where strength and battle prowess were essential, the Vikings understood something crucial. Fear is a weapon. Picture it. You're a king or a chief in Northern Europe. You've heard the rumors of Viking raids. You've heard stories of villages burned to the ground and warriors who fight with a savage hunger. You've readied your defenses, prepared your people. But what if you're already too late? Because long before a Viking blade ever crosses your doorstep, the fear has already set in. This wasn't a coincidence. The Vikings knew how to spread fear like wildfire, and it wasn't just for show. Fear played a huge role in the psychological warfare they waged. Even before they arrived on the scene, the Vikings understood the immense power of their reputation, and they used it to cripple their enemies, sometimes without having to fight at all. But how did they do it? The Vikings were masters of psychological warfare. Think about this. What if your enemy's fear of you was stronger than the physical damage you could inflict? For the Vikings, this wasn't just a thought. It was part of their battle plan. They knew that fear was the key to breaking down resistance before a single arrow was shot. Their terrifying battle cries, their brutal reputation, the sheer image of them descending from their longships. These were not just tactics to intimidate. They were carefully cultivated tools of psychological manipulation. Imagine hearing the stories of Viking warriors, their faces painted with blood and rage, coming for your village. The panic that sets in, the chaos that follows before they even make it to your shores. It's enough to dismantle any defense before the first swing of the axe. But it wasn't just their terror-inducing presence that made them so dangerous. Vikings were careful to create a reputation for violence and savagery that extended beyond their actual raids. When they returned from a raid, it wasn't just with treasure. They returned with stories. Stories of how they had obliterated entire villages, of how no one was safe when the Vikings came. These stories were spread from one community to the next, creating a domino effect of fear. The Vikings didn't just want to win. They wanted to inspire terror, and this reputation alone often caused their enemies to submit before they even fought. It's hard to believe, isn't it, that something as intangible as fear could be more powerful than an army? But the Vikings didn't just understand this. They exploited it for all it was worth. Their raids weren't just about destruction. They were about creating a fear so deep that it paralyzed their enemies. But let's take a closer look. Did the Vikings just rely on brute strength, or was there something more calculating at work? Vikings were incredibly organized. Despite their image as wild, barbaric warriors, the truth is far more complex. Their raids were not chaotic at all. In fact, the Vikings were extremely strategic, using every advantage available to them. Their ships, for example, were unlike anything anyone had seen before. The longships allowed them to travel long distances at incredible speed, allowing for lightning-fast raids. They could strike at a village and disappear before their enemies even realized they were there. This strategy wasn't just about moving quickly, it was about precision. The Vikings carefully selected their targets, often hitting when their enemies were least prepared. They understood the value of surprise and used it to their advantage, leaving no room for retaliation. The Vikings were not just strong warriors, they were expert planners, strategists, and organizers. Even when they weren't raiding, the Vikings were always thinking ahead, adapting to new circumstances. They didn't just stay in one place and fight battles. They explored new lands, traded, and created alliances that would give them an advantage in future raids. They could shift from being raiders to settlers, blending into new cultures and using that cultural knowledge to plan their next move. Their adaptability made them unpredictable and difficult to stop. You might think that the Vikings were just opportunistic warriors, but in reality, they were some of the most organized and adaptable fighters in history. This combination of unpredictable surprise tactics and precise planning turned them from feared raiders to nearly invincible adversaries. Now think about this. If the Vikings were so adaptable and strategic, why were they able to instill fear in so many different cultures? It's one thing to be a skilled fighter, but it's another to outthink and outmaneuver your enemies. The Vikings weren't just relying on muscle, they were also using their minds to get ahead. Oh, when they raided, they didn't just come for gold or land, they came to destabilize. Let me tell you something most people don't know about Viking raids. The Vikings were so skilled in psychological warfare that they were able to create fear long before they reached their target. They knew how to manipulate the narrative of terror so that when they did show up, it was almost too late for anyone to fight back. The Vikings built a reputation based on the fear they created, and that reputation spread like wildfire. Imagine you're a king or a chief hearing rumors of Viking raids in neighboring lands. The terror would have already set in by the time they arrived, and that fear, it was as potent as any weapon they carried. It wasn't just the physical violence that made them terrifying, it was the way they built a legacy of fear. They understood that fear was contagious, and they used that to weaken their enemies' will to fight before they even showed up. The Vikings didn't just carve a legacy through conquests or the blood of their enemies. They also left an indelible mark through something far more subtle yet equally powerful: their influence on the cultures they encountered. What makes the Vikings so fascinating isn't just their warrior prowess or their brutal raids, it's how they shaped the very civilizations they clashed with. You've probably heard of Viking raids as some of the most terrifying moments in European history, but did you know that the Vikings also played a pivotal role in shaping the culture of their their enemies? While we associate them with violence and devastation, their raids also opened the doors to cultural exchange. The very people they fought with and plundered would, over time, adopt elements of Viking life, technology, language, and customs. These exchanges weren't just fleeting. They had long-lasting effects on the development of entire regions. Think about it. The Vikings didn't just destroy, they built. They didn't only steal treasure, they contributed knowledge. As they moved from one region to another, from the British Isles to the shores of France, they left behind more than just destruction. They left behind their influence. What's even more shocking is that, far from being a one-way influence, the Vikings themselves learned from the very people they conquered. They were adapters, not just destroyers, picking up new ways of life and technologies from the places they raided. Over time, they fused these elements into their own culture. So when they struck, it wasn't with pure chaos. They brought new ideas that would change the future of the very regions they attacked. Let's start with one of the most impactful aspects of Viking influence, their technological innovations. The Viking longship, one of their greatest technological achievements, revolutionized both travel and warfare. This adaptability gave the Vikings the ability to raid swiftly and to penetrate deep into Europe, far beyond what anyone had imagined possible. It wasn't just the Viking raiders who benefited from these ships. Once the Vikings began trading, their ships also brought goods and ideas to far-flung parts of the world. The technology behind the longship spread, shaping naval engineering in places like the British Isles, and even influencing the development of fleets far outside Europe. But the Vikings didn't just leave behind a legacy of technological advancement. They also introduced new languages, which became the bedrock for modern European languages. Old Norse, the language of the Vikings, left traces in many of the languages we speak today. In England, for example, many place names, words, and even grammatical structures are derived from Old Norse. More than just a language of conquest, Old Norse became a bridge between cultures, influencing the languages of the Anglo-Saxons and the Celtic peoples. Yet, Viking influence went even deeper. They brought with them ideas of governance, trade, and social organization that reshaped the regions they encountered. In France, for instance, the Viking raids and eventual settlements in Normandy led to the creation of a new hybrid society. The Normans, as they were known, fused Viking customs with the Roman and Frankish cultures they encountered. This resulted in the establishment of one of the most powerful and culturally rich regions in Europe. Over time, the Normans would go on to play a crucial role in shaping the history of not only France but England as well, with the infamous Norman conquest of 1066. As strange as it might sound, some of the very people the Vikings fought against eventually embraced their influence. Take the Anglo-Saxons, for example. They weren't just victims of Viking raids, they were also beneficiaries of Viking culture. The Vikings' relentless attacks led to changes in Anglo-Saxon defense systems, leading to innovations that would eventually help the Anglo-Saxons defend themselves. But even more profound was the shift in how the Anglo-Saxons governed themselves. Viking settlements in England influenced local politics, with Viking leaders often becoming part of the Anglo-Saxon nobility. You might be thinking, but didn't the Vikings just terrorize people and forcefully take over? That's part of the story, certainly, but the full picture is more nuanced. It's a story of trade, intermarriage, cultural exchange, and long-lasting impacts on the societies they raided. When the Vikings weren't fighting, they were trading, learning, and adapting. They were far more than mere invaders. They were cultural catalysts who left their mark on nearly every region they encountered. As we look at the Vikings' influence on their enemies, it's clear that they didn't just leave destruction in their wake. They helped to shape the future of the very regions they raided. This influence wasn't just about taking treasure or land. It was about transforming cultures, changing societies, and even laying the groundwork for future civilizations. The Vikings, with their cunning, adaptability, and thirst for knowledge, created a legacy that far outlasted their raids. What's perhaps most remarkable is how this Viking influence continues today. Modern perceptions of the Vikings, while still focused on their warrior identity, have also embraced the richness of their cultural legacies. Viking imagery is often used to symbolize strength, resilience, and toughness, but it also speaks to a deeper, more complex understanding of their impacts. They didn't just carve out an empire of fear, they carved out an empire of influence that shaped the very cultural fabric of Europe. This cultural legacy is often overlooked in the tales of Viking brutality, but when you look at the full picture, it becomes clear. The Vikings weren't just feared warriors, they were pioneers of cultural exchange, and their legacy lives on in ways most people don't realize. So, the next time you hear the word Viking, remember that their legacy is about much more than violence. It's about how they shaped the world around them, how their influence lives on today, and how their enemies, wittingly or unwittingly, helped preserve their culture. Viking fear continues to be a defining feature of their legacy, and it's not just a matter of historical facts or myths. The Vikings' reputation for terror and brutality was so deeply ingrained in the cultures they encountered that it still affects us today. Their savage ways, often magnified and exaggerated by storytellers and historians, have been immortalized as symbols of raw power and ruthlessness. But the truth is, the Vikings created something even more powerful than fear. They created a lasting legacy that still endures across centuries. Even today, Viking imagery evokes strength, toughness, and an unyielding spirit. spirit. But what makes this fear so unique is how it was carefully crafted, cultivated, and maintained, both during the Vikings' time and beyond. The Vikings didn't just want to be feared, they wanted to ensure that their legacy lived on in the minds of their enemies and future generations. What's even more fascinating is how the Vikings' reputation continues to influence how we perceive power today. Whether it's the images of fierce warriors in popular media, the symbols of Viking heritage, or the myths surrounding Viking culture, the fear they instilled continues to hold sway. It's easy to associate Vikings with brutal raids and terror, but there's something deeper at play here. The Vikings understood how to manipulate fear into a lasting, almost mythical reputation. And that reputation hasn't just survived, it's thrived, transforming into something that is still feared and revered. One of the most powerful ways the Vikings ensured their fearsome legacy was through their enduring cultural impact. They didn't just leave behind stories of violent raids, they reshaped the very regions they targeted, leaving a mark that wouldn't fade easily. The Vikings' ability to inspire fear in the people they conquered wasn't just about their brutal nature, it was about how they transformed the cultures around them. They understood something that few others did. Fear is a tool that, when wielded correctly, can turn the course of history. The Vikings knew how to use fear to intimidate, destabilize, and conquer, but they also used it to solidify their influence. Their enemies feared them, but their enemies also learned from them. Over time, even the most powerful civilizations adapted aspects of Viking life, from military tactics to cultural practices. The Vikings didn't just leave behind a history of terror, they left behind a legacy of power, resilience, and transformation. Yet, what truly makes the Viking legacy of fear so enduring is how it's been passed down through generations. Modern depictions of Vikings, from films to television shows to books, still rely on the image of the ruthless, bloodthirsty warrior. This portrayal might be exaggerated, but it remains a core element of Viking culture in the public imagination. Even today, Viking imagery is used to symbolize power and strength, whether it's in sports logos, military symbolism, or national identities. However, this enduring legacy also raises an important question. Was the fear of the Vikings truly justified, or did they simply master the art of creating a terrifying reputation? The answer, as it turns out, is more complex than we might think. The Vikings understood the psychological power of fear, and they used it as a strategic weapon. It wasn't enough to simply be brutal warriors. They needed to ensure that everyone believed they were unstoppable, invincible, and that belief was what made them so powerful. The Vikings' reputation didn't just come from their violent raids. It came from how they managed to infuse their culture with a sense of inevitability. They became a force of nature, a symbol of destruction and change, and for centuries that reputation held true. But what makes the Viking legacy even more intriguing is how it intersects with the modern world. Today, Viking fear isn't just something we read about in history books. It's alive and well, influencing how we view strength, resilience, and toughness. Viking-inspired symbols, like the Thor's hammer or the image of the longship, are used to evoke power and strength in a variety of contexts, from sports teams to movies to national identities. So, what is it about the Vikings that continues to resonate so strongly? It's not just their ability to create fear, it's their mastery of creating a legacy that endures, even long after their raids and battles are over. Their ability to inspire awe, terror, and respect has left an indelible mark on history, and that legacy continues to shape how we view power and strength today. In the end, the Vikings didn't just create fear, they created a myth that has persisted across centuries and continues to influence our culture and perceptions of power. Their legacy is far more than just a history of violence. It's a history of transformation, influence, and an enduring ability to shape the world around them. And that, more than anything, is what makes the Vikings such powerful enemies, both in their time and today. If you enjoyed this epic journey, please subscribe to our channel for more thrilling historical tales. Don't miss out on new videos. Hit the notification bell to stay updated.